This video is made for entertainment purposes only. My name is Marcus Webb, and I watched something on a security monitor that the government will never let me talk about publicly. For 17 years, I worked as a corrections officer at Coldwater Federal Penitentiary in northern Idaho, a place so remote that most people forget it exists. On October 14, 2003, I sat in a concrete room reviewing backup generator footage from the night before, and I saw a creature, 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, tear through reinforced steel bars like they were made of cardboard. But here's what haunts me most: it wasn't random. The Sasquatch came for one specific man, and somehow it knew he didn't belong there. This is my confession. This is what I know about the night the walls came down, and what I learned about justice, about intelligence beyond our understanding, and about the thin line between prisoner and captive. Coldwater wasn't like other federal prisons. Built in 1967 during the height of Cold War paranoia, it sat in a valley between the Clearwater Mountains and the Bitterroot Range, 40 miles from the nearest town. The facility housed 230 inmates, mostly violent offenders and organized crime figures who needed to disappear from the world for a while. Medium to high security. Concrete walls 18 feet high. Razor wire. Motion sensors along the perimeter. Guard towers at each corner. I'd been there since 1986, fresh out of the Marines, 23 years old, and thinking I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer in Beirut. Coldwater taught me I was wrong. I worked D-Block for most of my career, the violent offenders wing, and I learned to read men the way a zoologist reads animals. You learn the patterns. You learn who's dangerous and who's just broken. You learn the difference between a man who made a mistake and a man who enjoys hurting people. October 13, 2003, started like any other Monday night shift. I clocked in at 10 p.m., relieving Officer Ramirez at the D-Block control station. The prison ran on routine: count at 10:15, lights out at 11, security rounds every 30 minutes through the night. I had 4 other guards working the block with me: Thompson, Kowalski, Chen, and the new guy, Briggs, who'd only been on staff for 6 weeks. At 11:47 p.m., every light in Coldwater went dark. The backup generators should have kicked in within 5 seconds. That's what they're designed to do: maintain essential lighting, keep the cell locks engaged, keep the security systems running. But that night, we sat in complete darkness for almost 4 minutes. 4 minutes might not sound like long, but in a maximum security prison filled with violent men, 4 minutes of darkness is an eternity. I grabbed my flashlight and radio immediately. Control, this is Webb at D-Block. We've got a complete blackout. Generators aren't engaging. Confirm status. Static. Then Warden Holland's voice, tight with stress: all blocks report in. We've got facility-wide power loss. Generators are not responding. Emergency protocol is in effect. All officers maintain position at your posts. The inmates started yelling. Not panicked, excited. Darkness meant opportunity, and every man in D-Block knew it. I could hear them rattling their cell doors, testing the electronic locks, shouting to each other through the bars. Stay calm. I shouted into the block. Locks are still engaged. Nobody's going anywhere. But I wasn't sure that was true. Electronic locks need power, and backup batteries only last so long. At 11:51 p.m., the generators finally kicked in. The lights flickered back, dim emergency lighting, but enough to see. I did a quick visual sweep of the cell block. Every door was still locked. Every inmate was accounted for. I exhaled. Then Thompson's voice came over the radio, breathless and confused. Webb, you need to see this. East wall. Exterior. Something's wrong. I left Kowalski at the control station and headed outside with Thompson. The October air was cold, sharp in my lungs, and the moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the prison yard. We walked along the east perimeter, flashlights cutting through the darkness between the emergency floodlights. Thompson pointed ahead. There. The wall had a hole in it. Not a crack. Not damage from age or weather. A hole, jagged and deliberate, about 7 feet wide and 8 feet tall, chunks of concrete scattered on both sides like something had punched through from the outside in. The razor wire on top was twisted and torn, hanging in useless coils. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Thompson was shaking his head. That's 2 feet of reinforced concrete, Webb. You'd need explosives or a wrecking ball to do that kind of damage. And it happened during the blackout. Had to. We walked this perimeter at 11:30 and everything was fine. I stepped closer, running my flashlight beam over the edges of the breach. The concrete wasn't cracked in a pattern you'd see from an explosion. It was broken, torn. Pieces were ripped away in chunks, like something had physically pulled the wall apart with brute force. "Get Holland on the line," I said. "And get a count going. If something broke in, maybe something broke out." The count took 20 minutes. In that time, Warden Holland, the night shift commander, and half the security staff converged on the east wall. Floodlights were set up. Photos were taken. Everyone was trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Chin came running up, out of breath. "We've got a problem." Cell count in D block came up 1 short. Holland turned sharply. "Who?" "Joseph Redfeather. Cell 47. Door's still locked, but he's gone." My stomach dropped. Joseph Redfeather. I knew him well. He'd been at Coldwater for 11 months, serving 15 years for second-degree murder. Native American, mid-40s, quiet and dignified in a way that didn't fit most of the men in D block. He kept to himself, didn't cause trouble, didn't join gangs or get into fights. I'd spoken to him a few times during rounds. He always called me sir, always polite, always sad. And I'd always felt something was off about his case. "Run the backup footage," Holland ordered. "I want to see what happened during that blackout." We went to the security office, a cramped room filled with monitors and recording equipment. The main power had been out, but the backup generator fed a secondary recording system that captured low-resolution footage from 6 critical cameras. One of them covered the interior of D block. Holland, Chen, Thompson, and I crowded around the screen as the tech officer, a wiry guy named Patterson, queued up the footage. "Blackout starts at 11 hours 47 minutes and 22 seconds, Patterson said, clicking through the timeline. "Generators kick back in at 11 hours 51 minutes and 9 seconds. Let me fast forward through the dark section. There's nothing to see until the emergency lights come on." The screen was black for several seconds, then flickered to grainy grayscale as the backup lights engaged. The camera was positioned at the far end of D block, giving a wide view of the 2-tiered cell block. I could see the cell doors, the walkway, the shadows of inmates moving behind bars. Then I saw it. "Stop," I said. "Go back. Slowly." Patterson rewound and played it frame by frame. At 11 hours 51 minutes and 14 seconds, 5 seconds after the lights returned, there was movement at the far end of the block, near cell 47. A shadow, enormous and man-shaped but far too large, moving along the upper tier. "What the hell is that?" Thompson muttered. Patterson zoomed in as much as the resolution allowed. The figure was massive, 8, maybe 9 feet. Tall, covered in dark fur. It moved on 2 legs, fluid and deliberate, not clumsy or animal-like. It stopped at cell 47, and then it gripped the bars. Even in the grainy footage, you could see the steel bars bend. The creature pulled, and the entire doorframe warped, then tore free from the concrete wall with a shriek of metal that we couldn't hear on the silent footage but could imagine. Sparks flew from the severed electronic lock. The creature reached inside and pulled someone out, Joseph Redfeather, stumbling and clearly terrified, then slung him over its shoulder like a child. It turned and moved back the way it came, impossibly fast, and disappeared off camera. The entire event took 11 seconds. Nobody spoke. We watched Patterson rewind and play it 3 more times, and each time it looked less like a trick of the light and more like the impossible truth. Holland finally broke the silence. "Get me the exterior footage. East wall camera." Patterson switched feeds. The exterior camera had a clear view of the east wall breach. He fast-forwarded to 11 hours and 48 minutes, right after the blackout started. In the darkness, there was nothing visible for almost a minute. Then, at 11 hours 49 minutes and 12 seconds, the emergency floodlights kicked on early, likely a separate battery system, and illuminated the wall. The creature was there, standing in front of the concrete barrier, its back to the camera. It was huge, broader than any man, with long arms and a pronounced slope to its shoulders. Dark brown or black fur covered its entire body. It stood completely still for a moment, as if studying the wall, and then it moved. It didn't ram the wall. It didn't use a tool. It gripped the concrete with both hands, fingers splayed wide, impossibly strong, and pulled. The wall resisted for only a moment. Then chunks started to break away. The creature tore into the concrete like it was ripping open a cardboard box, working methodically, widening the hole with raw, terrifying strength. Dust and debris filled the air. At 11 hours 50 minutes and 33 seconds, the hole was large enough. The creature stepped through, into the prison yard, and moved out of frame toward D Block. At 11 hours 52 minutes and 41 seconds, it returned. Joseph Redfeather was draped over its shoulder, conscious but not struggling. The creature stepped back through the breach and disappeared into the forest beyond. The footage ended. The room stayed silent for a long time after the footage ended. We'd all seen it, clear as day, impossible to deny, but our brains refused to process it. A creature, a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you wanted to call it. Real. Documented. Breaking into a federal prison. Warden Holland's face had gone pale. He was a career corrections officer, 32 years in the system, and I'd never seen him rattled. But now his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the phone. "This footage doesn't leave this room," he said quietly. "Patterson, make copies. 2 USBs, locked safe. Original stays in the system but flagged eyes only. Nobody talks about what we just saw until I get direction from the Bureau of Prisons." "Understood." We all nodded. Holland picked up the phone and dialed. I heard him ask for the regional director. Then the room went quiet as he explained the situation in careful, measured language. "Yes, sir. Structural breach. 1 inmate missing. We have unusual footage that requires immediate review. I'm requesting federal investigators on site by morning." He listened for a moment, then his expression darkened. "Sir, with respect, you need to see this footage before you make that determination. This isn't a standard escape. This is—" He paused, choosing his words. "This is beyond our operational scope." When he hung up, he looked at me. "Webb, you know Redfeather better than anyone on staff. I need you to pull his file, everything. Intake reports, case history, visitor logs, commissary records, behavioral notes. I want to know why that thing came for him specifically." "You think it was targeted?" Thompson asked. "Did that look random to you?" Holland snapped. "It knew exactly which cell. It didn't break into A block or C block. It went straight to D block, cell 47, grabbed Redfeather, and left. That's not random. That's intentional." He was right. And that meant the creature, whatever it was, had intelligence. Planning. Purpose. I headed to records while the others secured the breach and managed the increasingly restless inmate population. By 2 a.m., I was sitting in the administrative office with Joseph Redfeather's file spread across the desk, and the more I read, the more a sick feeling settled in my stomach. Joseph Redfeather, age 46. Nez Perce tribe, born and raised on the reservation near Lapwai, Idaho. No prior criminal record. High school education. Worked as a carpenter and wilderness guide. Married once. Divorced. No children. By all accounts, a quiet, law-abiding man who kept to his traditions and stayed out of trouble. Until March 2002, when he was arrested for the murder of Carl Hutchins, a land developer from Boise. I read through the case summary, the trial transcripts, the conviction documents. The prosecution story was straightforward. Hutchins had been purchasing land adjacent to reservation territory, legally, through private sales, with plans to develop a luxury resort and golf course. Environmental groups opposed it. Tribal leaders opposed it. There were protests, legal challenges, heated town halls. On March 8, 2002, Carl Hutchins was found dead in his truck on a remote forest road, 20 miles from the proposed development site. Single gunshot wound to the chest. A rifle was found nearby, wiped clean but with trace fibers matching Joseph Redfeather's clothing. Shell casings at the scene matched ammunition purchased by Redfeather 3 weeks earlier. Witnesses placed Redfeather in the area that day. The defense argued circumstantial evidence, suggested a setup, but couldn't provide an alibi. Redfeather himself maintained his innocence, said he'd been hunting alone that day but had no one to confirm it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a guilty verdict. 15 years, federal prison, because the crime occurred on land adjacent to federal territory. Open and shut. Except it wasn't. I'd read enough case files over the years to recognize the patterns. This one felt wrong. Redfeather's behavior in prison didn't match a man who'd murdered someone in cold blood. No violence. No anger. No bitterness. Just quiet resignation, like a man who'd accepted an injustice he couldn't fight. I found his intake interview, conducted when he first arrived at Coldwater. The prison psychologist, Dr. Brennan, had noted, "Subject presents as depressed but not hostile. Shows no signs of sociopathy or violent tendencies." When asked about the crime, subject becomes emotionally withdrawn and repeats only, "I didn't kill that man." Effect suggests genuine belief in his innocence rather than denial. Recommend monitoring for suicidal ideation. I flipped to the visitor logs. Redfeather had received visits from 2 people over his 11 months at Coldwater. His ex-wife, Marie Redfeather, 3 times, and an elderly man named Thomas Spotted Elk, listed as a tribal elder, twice. The most recent visit from Spotted Elk was October 10th, 3 days before the escape. I made a note to follow up on that. Next, I reviewed the behavioral reports. Redfeather had been written up exactly once, September 14th, for refusing a work detail assignment. The note from the supervising officer said, "Inmate Redfeather refused logging crew assignment, stated cultural. Objections to the specific forest area. Became visibly distressed when pressed. Accepted kitchen duty as alternative. No further issues. Cultural objections to a forest area." I felt the pieces starting to connect, though I didn't yet understand how. I kept reading. In his personal property inventory, Redfeather had few possessions. Some books, letters from his ex-wife, a leather pouch containing what the intake officer had described as tribal artifacts, stones, feathers, ceremonial items, non-contraband. And then I found something that made me stop cold. A confiscated letter, flagged by the mail screening officer but ultimately allowed through. It was from Thomas Spotted Elk, dated September 28th. Most of it was benign, words of encouragement, updates from the reservation, but one paragraph had been highlighted by the screener. "Joseph, I spoke to the old ones in the mountains. They remember your father. They remember the promises made generations ago, the agreements that your people and theirs would protect each other when the world became cruel. I told them what happened to you. I told them about the lies. They do not forget. They do not abandon their own. Be patient. Justice does not always come from the courts of men. The old ones in the mountains. They do not forget." I sat back in my chair, the weight of understanding settling over me. This wasn't just a prison break. This was a rescue. And somehow, the Sasquatch, the creature that broke through our walls, was connected to Redfeather's tribe, to promises made long ago, to a justice system that existed outside our laws. By 6 a.m., the federal investigators arrived. Not from the Bureau of Prisons. Not from the FBI's Standard Field Office. They came from somewhere else. 3 men in dark suits, no names given, IDs flashed too quickly to read. They took over the security office, reviewed the footage in private, and then called an emergency meeting with Holland, myself, and the senior staff. The lead investigator, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in military intelligence, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Gentlemen, what you witnessed last night is classified under National Security Directive 47B. You will not discuss this event with anyone outside this facility. You will not speak to media. You will not file standard incident reports. The breach will be officially documented as structural failure due to seismic activity. Joseph Redfeather will be listed as an escapee, standard manhunt protocols, but there will be no mention of how he escaped." "That's it," Holland said, his voice tight. We just pretend we didn't see what we saw? The investigator's expression didn't change. You saw footage of a structural breach and a missing inmate. Anything else is speculation. That wasn't speculation, I said. That was 9 feet of something that tore through steel and concrete like paper. You're telling us to ignore that. I'm telling you that this matter is above your clearance level and outside your jurisdiction. He turned to face me directly. Officer Webb, I understand you've been reviewing Redfeather's case file. I need that file, and I need any notes you've made. I hesitated. Why Redfeather? Why did it come for him specifically? The investigator didn't answer. He simply held out his hand. I gave him the file. After they left with the footage, the files, and a signed non-disclosure agreement from every staff member who'd been on duty, Holland called me into his office. You believe Redfeather was innocent, don't you? He said. I nodded slowly. I think someone set him up. I think it was related to that land development deal, and I think whoever really killed Hutchins wanted Redfeather out of the way. Why? Because Redfeather was a wilderness guide. He knew those mountains better than anyone. If there were things out there, creatures that the tribe had been protecting for generations, Redfeather would have known. And if someone was planning to develop that land, tear down forests, build resorts, they'd need him silenced. Holland leaned back in his chair, exhausted. You realize how that sounds. I know how it sounds. But you saw the footage. Something came for him. Something that knew where he was, knew he didn't belong here, and had the strength to break him out. That's not an animal. That's intelligence. That's loyalty. Holland was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What do you think happened to him? I think he's free, I said. Really free. Maybe for the first time since his arrest. The official investigation lasted 2 weeks. The story fed to the media was exactly what the federal agent said it would be. Structural failure, 1 escapee, ongoing manhunt. Redfeather's photo was circulated. Roadblocks were set up. Search teams combed the forests. They found nothing. I couldn't let it go. During my off hours, I started digging into the Carl Hutchins case on my own. I wasn't an investigator, I was a prison guard, but I knew people and I knew how to ask questions. I tracked down one of the environmental activists who'd opposed the resort development, a grad student named Marcus Chen who'd organized protests in 2001 and 2002. We met at a diner in Coeur d'Alene. Joseph Redfeather didn't kill Carl Hutchins, Chen said immediately when I brought up the case. Everyone who knew him knew that. He was framed. By who? Hutchins had partners, silent investors who backed his development projects. One of them was a guy named Vincent Driscoll, real estate mogul out of Seattle. Ruthless. The kind of guy who doesn't take no for an answer. When the environmental challenges kept delaying the resort, and when tribal leaders kept pushing back, Hutchins started getting cold feet. Word was, he wanted to pull out of the deal. And 2 weeks later, he's dead. Redfeather gets arrested. The case goes away. 6 months after Redfeather's conviction, the land sale goes through, Driscoll buys it directly, development moves forward. If Redfeather was framed, why didn't his defense team find this? Chen shook his head. They tried. But Driscoll's connected. Judges, prosecutors, law enforcement. And the physical evidence against Redfeather was solid. Someone made sure of that. I thought about the rifle, the shell casings, the fibers. You think Driscoll had people plant evidence? I think Driscoll had someone kill Hutchins and make it look like Redfeather did it. And I think the reason they picked Redfeather specifically was because he was one of the few people who knew what was really in those mountains. There it was again. What was really in those mountains? The Sasquatch, I said quietly. Chen didn't laugh. He didn't look surprised. He leaned forward, his voice low. The tribes around here don't call them Sasquatch. They call them the forest people, the old ones, the guardians. They've been here longer than we have. Most people think it's mythology, folklore. But some of us know better. Hutchins was planning to clear-cut 2,000 acres of old-growth forest, habitat that's been undisturbed for centuries. You think the forest people were going to let that happen? So Redfeather was protecting them. Redfeather was honoring agreements his ancestors made generations ago. And when he got railroaded into prison for a murder he didn't commit, I guess the forest people decided to honor their side of the agreement. I left that meeting with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. Joseph Redfeather had been telling the truth all along. 3 weeks after the escape, I received a letter at the prison. No return address. Postmarked from Kamei, Idaho, a small town on the reservation. Inside was a single handwritten page. Officer Webb. You treated me with respect when others did not. You listened when I said I was innocent, even if you could not help. I want you to know the truth. I did not kill Carl Hutchins. I was framed by men who wanted to destroy the land and the beings who have lived there since the time before memory. I accepted my fate because I believed no one would listen to a native man against powerful white men. But the old ones listened. They remembered my family. They remembered the promises. On the night of the blackout, one of them came for me, a guardian named Dakota, whom my father once saved from a hunter's trap when I was a boy. He repaid the debt. I am free now, Officer Webb. I am home. The land is safe. The agreements hold. I hope one day the truth about Carl Hutchins comes to light. But even if it does not, I am at peace. Walk gently in the world. Joseph Redfeather. I read that letter a dozen times. Then I locked it in my personal safe at home, where it stayed for 20 years. I should have let it go. I should have filed away Redfeather's letter, accepted the impossibility of what I'd witnessed, and moved on with my life. But something gnawed at me, a sense of unfinished business, of a story that needed completion. I'd spent 17 years watching men locked in cages, some guilty, some perhaps not, and I'd never had the power to change their fates. But this time felt different. This time, I could do something. I started investigating Vincent Driscoll. It wasn't easy. Driscoll was a multimillionaire with connections that reached into state government, law enforcement, and federal agencies. His real estate empire stretched across the Pacific Northwest, built on aggressive land acquisition and ruthless business practices. He'd been sued dozens of times, environmental violations, contractual disputes, intimidation, but nothing ever stuck. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Cases settled quietly. I spent my off days at libraries, searching old newspaper archives. I interviewed former employees who'd left Driscoll's company. I talked to journalists who'd tried and failed to write exposés about him. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Driscoll didn't just develop land. He took it. When people wouldn't sell, he found ways to force them. Property devaluations through environmental contamination, harassment, legal intimidation, and in at least 3 cases I could document, suspicious deaths of people who'd stood in his way. Carl Hutchins had been the public face of the Clearwater Resort project, but Driscoll was the money behind it. And according to a former accountant I tracked down in Spokane, a nervous man named Alan Park who agreed to meet me only after I promised anonymity, Hutchins had been ready to back out. Carl wasn't a bad guy, Park told me over coffee, his hands shaking slightly. He was a developer, sure, but he had limits. When he saw the environmental impact reports, when he understood what that resort would do to the watershed and the old-growth forests, he wanted out. He told Driscoll in February 2002 that he was withdrawing from the project. What did Driscoll say? He told Carl that withdrawing wasn't an option, that they had contracts, investors, commitments. Carl didn't care. He said he'd rather lose money than destroy that land. Park looked at me with hollow eyes. 3 weeks later, Carl was dead. You think Driscoll had him killed? I know he did. I was at a meeting the day before Carl died. Driscoll was on the phone with someone, I don't know who, and I heard him say, "Handle the Hutchins problem and make sure it looks like the Indian did it." Those were his exact words. My blood went cold. You told the police this? Park laughed bitterly. I tried. I called the detective handling the case. He said he'd look into it. 2 days later, I got a visit from 2 men who explained very clearly that if I repeated what I'd heard, my family would suffer for it. My daughter was 7 years old, Officer Webb. What would you have done? I didn't answer. I understood. After Red Feather was convicted, Park continued, I quit working for Driscoll. I couldn't be part of it anymore. I've lived with the guilt ever since. But I kept records, copies of financial documents, emails, meeting notes. I've been waiting for someone to care enough to use them. He slid a USB drive across the table. Everything's on there. Bank transfers to a man named Cole Brennan, ex-military, worked as Driscoll's security consultant. Brennan was in the Clearwater area the day Hutchins died. He disappeared 3 months after Red Feather's conviction, and nobody's seen him since. My guess is Driscoll tied up that loose end too. I took the drive. Why give this to me now? Why not go to the FBI? Because I don't trust the FBI. Half of them are probably on Driscoll's payroll. But you're just a prison guard who saw something impossible and didn't look away. Maybe that makes you the right person. He stood up, preparing to leave. Be careful, Officer Webb. Driscoll destroys people who get in his way. I spent 3 days reviewing everything on that drive. Financial records showing payments to Cole Brennan totaling over $200,000 in the months before and after Hutchins' death. Emails between Driscoll and his lawyers discussing contingency plans if Hutchins withdrew from the project. Meeting notes that referenced removing obstacles and ensuring cooperation. It was enough. Not for a conviction, not without Brennan to testify, and he was likely dead, but enough to reopen the case, enough to cast serious doubt on Red Feather's guilt. I made copies and secured the originals in a safety deposit box. Then I contacted the one person I thought might listen, a federal prosecutor named Sarah Killian who'd gained a reputation for taking on corruption cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch. We met at her office in Boise. I laid out everything, the evidence from Park, the pattern of Driscoll's behavior, the framing of Joseph Red Feather. I left out the part about the Sasquatch. That wouldn't help my credibility. Killian listened carefully, taking notes, asking pointed questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. This is solid work, Officer Webb. Circumstantial in places, but there's enough here to justify reopening the Hutchins case and investigating Driscoll. I'll need to verify some of these documents, interview Park if he's willing, and see if I can find any trace of Cole Brennan. But if what you're telling me is true, we might be able to get Red Feather's conviction overturned. There's one problem, I said. Red Feather escaped from federal custody. Even if we prove he was innocent of murder, he's still a fugitive. Killian smiled slightly. Let me worry about that. If we can prove he was wrongfully convicted, we can argue that his escape was an act of desperation by an innocent man. With the right judge, we might be able to get the escape charges dropped and issue a full pardon. But first, we need to find him. I don't know where he is, I lied. I had my suspicions, but I wasn't going to lead federal authorities into the mountains where the forest people lived. Fair enough, Killian said. We'll move forward with what we have. I'll be in touch. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe Joseph Red Feather's name would be cleared. Maybe justice, however delayed, would prevail. But I also knew the story wasn't complete. I needed to understand the other side, the side that existed in the deep forests, beyond the reach of human law. I needed to find the forest people. I took a week of vacation in November 2003, 1 month after the escape. I drove to Lapwai, the town at the heart of the Nez Perce Reservation, and asked around until I found someone who knew Thomas Spotted Elk, the elder who'd visited Red Feather in prison. Spotted Elk lived in a small house at the edge of the reservation, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a valley. He was in his 80s, lean and weathered, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. When I knocked on his door and introduced myself, he nodded as if he'd been expecting me. "You're the guard," he said. "The one who was kind to Joseph." "Yes, sir." "Come in." We sat in his living room, drinking coffee, and I explained why I'd come. I told him about the evidence I'd gathered, about the prosecutor who was reopening the case. And then I told him what I really wanted, to understand what had happened that night at the prison, and to know if Joseph was truly safe. Spotted Elk listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the mountains beyond. "What you're asking," he said finally, "is to see something that most people deny exists. To step into a world that runs parallel to yours, but older and deeper. Are you prepared for that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I need to understand. I need to know that Joseph is okay, and I need to know the truth about the beings who took him." Spotted Elk studied me carefully. Then he nodded. "You have an honest heart, Marcus Webb. That's rare. I will take you into the mountains. But you must swear that you will never reveal the location of what I show you, and you will never bring others. These are sacred places, protected by agreements older than your country. Do you swear?" "I swear." The next morning, we drove into the Clearwater National Forest. Spotted Elk directed me along logging roads and fire trails until we reached a trailhead that wasn't marked on any map. We hiked for 3 hours, climbing steadily into old-growth forest where the trees were massive and ancient, their canopy blocking most of the sunlight. "This is their territory," Spotted Elk said quietly. "They've lived here for thousands of years, long before Europeans came, long before even my people arrived. We call them the Sakami, the Forest Guardians. They are not animals, Marcus. They are people. Different from us, but people nonetheless." We walked in silence for another hour. I felt watched, though I saw nothing. The forest was still, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and moss. Then Spotted Elk stopped and raised his hand. He spoke in his native language, words I didn't understand, and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the trees ahead of us moved. Not the branches. The trunks themselves seemed to shift, and I realized with a shock that what I'd thought were shadows were actually living beings, camouflaged so perfectly against the forest that they'd been invisible. 3 of them stepped forward. They were enormous, 8 to 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown and black fur, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. Their faces were more human than ape-like, with deep-set eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. They moved with calm confidence, not threatening, but radiating a presence that made me instinctively step back. Spotted Elk spoke to them again in his language, gesturing toward me. One of them, the largest, with silver-streaked fur around his face, responded in a deep, rumbling voice that formed words I almost recognized. Not English, not Nez Perce, but something older. Spotted Elk turned to me. "This is Dakota. He is the one who brought Joseph home. He wants to know why you've come." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet Dakota's gaze. "I came to make sure Joseph is safe, and to thank you for what you did. He was innocent. He was protecting you, and he suffered for it. What you did, breaking him out, was an act of justice." Spotted Elk translated. Dakota listened, then spoke again, his voice like distant thunder. "He says Joseph is safe," Spotted Elk relayed. "He lives among them now, in a place humans cannot find. He helps them understand the changing world, and they give him peace. Dakota says Joseph's father saved his life many years ago, when he was caught in a trap set by hunters. The debt has been repaid, but more than that, Joseph is kin. They do not abandon kin." Tears stung my eyes. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd spent so many years in a place where loyalty and honor were rare, where men betrayed each other for cigarettes or status. To see it here, in beings we'd dismissed as myth, was overwhelming. "Tell him thank you," I said. "And tell him I'm working to clear Joseph's name in the human world. It might take time, but I won't stop until it's done." Spotted Elk translated. Dakota nodded slowly, and then he did something I'll never forget. He reached out his massive hand and placed it on my shoulder, gentle, deliberate, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Then he and the others turned and disappeared back into the forest, vanishing as completely as if they'd never been there. The legal process took 3 years. Prosecutor Sarah Killian built a meticulous case against Vincent Driscoll. She tracked down Cole Brennan's surviving family members and obtained financial records showing his payments from Driscoll. She interviewed former employees, environmental activists, and witnesses who'd been too afraid to speak during the original trial. And in 2006, a federal grand jury indicted Driscoll on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. The trial was a media spectacle. Driscoll's defense team fought viciously, but the evidence was overwhelming. In March 2007, Vincent Driscoll was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. 2 months later, Joseph Redfeather's murder conviction was formally vacated. A federal judge ruled that he had been wrongfully convicted based on fabricated evidence, and that his escape from Coldwater had been an act of desperation by an innocent man. All charges were dropped. A full pardon was issued. Of course, Joseph never came forward to claim it. The official record listed him as whereabouts unknown, and the case was quietly closed. Most people assumed he died in the wilderness after his escape. I knew better. In 2008, I received another letter, again postmarked from the reservation. Officer Webb. I heard about the trial. I heard that the truth finally came to light, and that Driscoll will spend the rest of his life in a cage, as I once did. There is justice in that, though it does not undo the harm he caused. I want you to know that I am well. I have found a life beyond the world of concrete and steel, a life among people who understand the old ways and the importance of balance. I am happy, Marcus. Perhaps happier than I ever was before. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for believing in the truth even when it seemed impossible. The Forest Guardians send their respect. They call you Friend Who Sees. It is a title given to very few humans. Walk gently, Joseph. I'm 73 years old now, writing this in 2033, 30 years after the night the walls came down at Coldwater. I retired from corrections in 2009 and spent the last 2 decades working as an advocate for wrongfully convicted inmates. I've helped overturn 6 convictions and brought attention to dozens more cases where justice failed. I never went back into the mountains. I kept my promise to Spotted Elk, who passed away in 2011. I've never revealed the location of the Forest People's territory, and I never will. Coldwater Federal Penitentiary closed in 2015, deemed too remote and too expensive to maintain. The buildings sit empty now, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Sometimes I wonder if the Forest People walk through those ruins, seeing it as proof that concrete and steel cannot stand forever against the patient power of nature. I think about Joseph Redfeather often. I imagine him living somewhere in those ancient forests, moving between 2 worlds, a bridge between human and forest guardian, between present and past. I imagine him at peace, finally, after everything he endured. And I think about the night I watched that footage, the moment I saw something impossible become real. It changed me. It taught me that the world is far stranger and more wondrous than we acknowledge, that intelligence and dignity exist in forms we've dismissed as legend, and that justice isn't always found in courtrooms and prisons. Vincent Driscoll died in prison in 2019, 12 years into his sentence. I felt nothing when I heard. Some men are beyond redemption. But Joseph Redfeather, wrongly imprisoned, rescued by beings out of myth, vindicated by a system that had failed him, he represents something else. He represents the idea that loyalty and honor still matter, that debts are repaid across generations, that the old agreements between humans and the natural world still hold power. I'm an old man now, and I don't have many years left. When I die, this account will be released, my testimony to the truth of what happened in October 2003. Some will dismiss it as the ravings of a senile ex-guard. Others might believe. But the truth doesn't need belief to exist. Somewhere in the mountains of Idaho, the Forest People still live. They still keep their promises. They still remember. And somewhere among them, I hope, walks a man named Joseph Redfeather, free, vindicated, and home. That's the justice that matters most. That's the truth that will shock you. Not that Sasquatch exists, but that they care about justice more than we do. That they honor their debts and protect their own. That they see innocence and guilt more clearly than our courts ever could. I watched a Sasquatch break a convict out of prison. But it wasn't just a breakout. It was a rescue. It was justice. And it was real.